Oh, howdy all, grab yourselves a beer. It is time for some Path of Exile discussion. Today, I want to talk about the Redeemer-influenced items. Redeemer-influenced items can be found through doing some of the new Conquerors of the Atlas content. They're a permanent addition to the game, so I'm recording this during Metamorph League, but they're intended to remain in the future of the game. And whilst this information is current as of the 9th of January 2020, things may change after this. I think that most of this will stay roughly as is into the future. So firstly, how do you get Redeemer items? Redeemer items can be created via three main methods. The first one is by killing Veritania the Redeemer or by killing monsters in Veritania influenced maps. So when you kill Veritania, she will drop at least one and often two Redeemer influenced items. These will be a random base. They'll have an item level that is two higher than the zone level in which you fought Veritania. So if you're fighting her in a tier 14 map, then they'll be item level 83. If you're fighting her in a tier 16 map, which appears to be as high as you can get, then they will be item level 85. 86 and up are created via different means, which we'll get to in a sec. These items that drop this way are they can be crafted further. But when they'll drop as unidentified rare items. When you identify them, they will then have 4 to 6 mods as per a normal rare item, but at least one of those mods will be from the Redeemer pool. You can then further craft them. You can use Scouring Orbs, you can use Transmutations, Alterations, Regals, you can use Alchemy Orbs, Chaos Orbs, you can even use more specific things like Essences or Fossils. And whenever a mod is rolled, there'll be a chance for it to roll as one of the Redeemer mods. The way that works, in terms of the numbers involved, let's say that you're rolling, let's not go an Amulet because I have too many different rolls. Let's go with Boots. Each roll that can come up will have a particular weighting. Think of this as the number of tickets in a raffle. So Virile, there's 1,000 tickets in the raffle that say Virile on them. There'll also be a number that Legends that has increased armor and evasion tier 1. If your item level is 84 or higher, there'll be 1,000 of those. Movement speed. If your item level is not 86, so let's say it's exactly 84, then there'll be 1,000 tickets that say Cheaters, but there'll be no tickets that say Hellions because your item's not high enough level. And some of these are rarer than others, so if we have a look, I think reduced attribute requirements is a bit rarer, so it's 45% rarer than getting, say, a single tier of movement speed. Then the Redeemer mods have their own weighting, and often these are pretty rare mods in comparison. 1,000 is the default, so you'll see that pretty much most of these mods that can roll on Boots are 1,000, but some of the Redeemer mods are very rare in comparison. 250, so that means that it's 4 times as rare as getting 35% move speed. Or 500 means it's twice as rare. So that means that there'll be 500 mods in the pool, 500 tickets in the raffle that are for tier 1 physical damage added as extra cold, and you'll have a chance to roll those. So when you identify a newly dropped Redeemer item, it will be biased so that you always get at least one of these mods, but when you craft it yourself using Chaos Orbs or alterations or whatever, there will be no such bias. There'll be no such minimum of one of the new mods. You could very well roll an item that has no special mods on it at all. So that's the first way that they're created. They drop from Veritania or one of her minions, and you then craft them however you want. The second way that you come across them is by taking an item that has no influences on it, that has 5 mods or fewer and that is rare, and then by applying a Redeemer's Exalted Orb. Veritania herself will sometimes drop these. They're pretty rare, and they allow you to turn a normal item into a Redeemer item, and they will add a single mod from the Redeemer pool when they do this. So if you've got a 5 mod item, let's say you've got a set of boots that have life, movement speed, and 3 resists on them. You're pretty happy with that. If you use a Redeemer's Exalted Orb on those items, then they'll pick up a 6th mod, which will have to be a prefix because your 3 resists are suffixes, and you've got 2 prefixes, and all rare items in Path of Exile are capped at 3 prefixes and 3 suffixes. So it will have to be a prefix, and it will be drawn from the Redeemer pool specifically. Now, very important little note on using Redeemer Orbs. Firstly, doing so permanently makes the item a redeemer item. If it was not influenced before, if it was not influenced before, it then becomes a redeemer item. Secondly, Redeemer Exalted Orbs do not care whether the item can roll attack modifiers or not. Likewise, they do not care if it can roll caster modifiers, things like that. Anything that restricts what can roll on an item doesn't seem to apply to these new mods. So, the other way that you can get Redeemer influenced items is by using an Awakener's Orb. I've made other videos on those. I'm not really going to go into that in any detail here. Just to say that this consumes a different Redeemer item and then puts its influence onto another item. So if you have, say, a Shaper item and a Redeemer item, you can merge them into one Shaper and Redeemer item, which in a way gives you a new chance to get Redeemer affixes on an item. So let's have a look at each different item class in turn. So this is amulets, rings, etc. And some of the things that I think are worth looking at specifically on these, on the Redeemer affixes. So first up, we have the amulets. Now, amulets have a lot of possible rolls on them, and a lot of these have high probabilities. That means that there is a pretty slim chance of getting any specific Redeemer item, any specific Redeemer mod when you apply a Chaos Orb to a Redeemer amulet, or an Alteration Orb, or if you use an Exalted Orb on a amulet that is already a Redeemer item. This doesn't make it impossible, it just means that it won't happen very often. I want to go through not every single mod that's available, but just the ones that I think are more interesting and more powerful, or at least that have some particular niche. So firstly, let's go down the list. Cold damage leached as energy shield. This is something that's very hard to get on attack builds. And there's usually generally a very high price that you pay for leeching your attack damage as energy shield in any way. So this is a way to do this if you're making attacks that primarily deal cold damage. I don't actually think this is the best of this type of mod. I think the best one of them is lightning damage, which is in the Crusader pool, because of the unique Claw, Hand of Wisdom in action, which is popular on some builds that do a lot of intelligence stacking and also energy shield. Those are attack builds that really will gain a lot from this mod. However, there's certainly a space for niche builds that can use this mod. If you're doing a lot of cold damage with attacks and your primary defensive layer is energy shield, then this is a potentially very good mod that you should investigate and consider trying to get an amulet that is good without this mod and then has this on top to make it even stronger. However, it is a very niche one, and for a lot of builds you'll find something else that is that's easy to get and that's just better. Next up, we have increased damage per dexterity, 1% damage per 15 dexterity. This requires a hell of a lot of investment in order to get it to be better than elemental damage with attacks high tier roll. And so for that reason, I don't think that this is going to be particularly popular, but it is a strong option if you're making a build that scales dexterity very high. The next one I think is a bit more general and is a Raider specific mod. 5 to 6% increased damage per frenzy charge, and you're going to want to define this to be 6%. So 6% increased damage per frenzy charge. That's a lot of damage if you're playing a Raider that stacks frenzy charges. That goes down the frenzy charge section of the Raider tree, and so that's going to be something that I think a lot of builds will have a use for. Whether it's the best option or whether there's something else that can be better is another question, but this is a solid mod. It's also very powerful if you can combine this. So you can get this mod and also get from the normal roll pool tier 1 weapon elemental damage. That will make for an incredibly high damage amulet that then, if you're playing a character that doesn't really prioritize defense very much, especially in softcore, you can get away with doing that. Just make something that's a real glass cannon but does so much damage that no one really cares. Next up, we have damage penetrates 8 to 10% cold resistance. You'll notice there's a real theme with Veritania the Redeemer's items about dealing cold damage, and this is no exception. This is a solid mod if you're playing around, if you're dealing a lot of cold damage. However, now we've gone through a lot of the sort of mid-tier, solid but not spectacular mods. Now we're going to get to the spectacular one. +1 to the level of all cold skill gems. This is huge for a lot of gems. Now, it's my belief that this applies to, well, firstly, I know for certain this applies to all cold gems, whether they are in your amulet. Well, I mean, they're not usually going to be in your amulet. That's under pretty ridiculously weird circumstances that you could get this mod onto a talisman that has a slot in it. So that's not likely to happen. But if you've got this mod, it applies to gems that are socketed anywhere. So if you've got cold skill gems that are in your chest, that are in your shield, whatever, doesn't matter, it applies to them. This is particularly good with two things. Firstly, with spells that deal cold damage, because of the way that spells scale. +1 gem level usually means 8% more damage or so if the skill gem is level 21 to 30. It usually means 10% more damage if the gem is level 1 to 20, and it usually means 5% if it exceeds 30. This does vary from gem to gem, and you should definitely check that. But this is a multiplier. It stacks with everything else you can do. It's really strong. You can also, and I think a lot of people should do this, you can also combine this with another +1 to the level of, say, strength skill gems, dexterity skill gems, or intelligence skill gems from the hunter pool, and that can make something really, really, truly amazing. So +1 to level of all dex skill gems from the hunter pool, +1 to all cold skills from the redeemer pool, will give you 2 levels on both Herald of Ice and a lot of other cold related skills. Very powerful combination and something to seriously consider. So, in terms of suffixes, first up we have a reduced mana reservation. Now, at the time that I'm recording this video, I believe it's still possible to combine this with the very similar shaper mod that exists. So this is called mana reservation reduced, and the shaper one is called reduced mana reservations cost. The fact that they've got different names means that I believe they can both roll. And that's something that would surprise a lot of people. It certainly surprised me when I found out about it. This means that you can combine these onto the same item and get an item with 10% reduced mana reservation as an amulet. That'll take up 2 of the suffixes, but there's still space for more good mods on it as well. Mana reservation is an interesting stat. The more of you have, the more that every point makes your character better. So the difference between going from, say, 10% mana reservation reduced to 20% isn't a huge jump in character power, but going from 50% to 60% is a gigantic jump in character power, and going from 70% to 80% is even more again. This allows you to run more and more and more and more auras, making a character potentially even more powerful than they otherwise would be. And it's one of the founding principles of Aurabot characters is that they stack as much mana reservation reduction as they possibly can in order to get as much benefit as they can out of auras. So, with that in mind, this mod, as long as it is possible to get benefit from both the Shaper version and the Redeemer version, there will be a niche demand for combining these two into one mod that gives 10% reservation reduction. That's a very, very powerful effect. Second up in the suffixes is 12% increased dexterity. I kind of need to do a video on stat stacking amulets because they are really, really strong. This is a bad mod on most builds, but it is absolutely god tier on some of them. You'll notice the obvious synergy with increased damage per 15 dexterity. That's no accident. It's very difficult to get both of these mods on the same item. This is not particularly common. This is not particularly common either. So it's unlikely that you'll get both of them. But the key power comes from having lots of other items that have increased percentage dexterity on them as well. That adds a lot to your character and will really make you explode in power. I'm less impressed with the specific reduced reservations. Purity of Ice having a reduced reservation is strong if you are doing a multi-linked Purity of Ice. Hatred and Grace will have their space on some builds. If your build is wanting to run one of these two auras, then this is a solid mod for you, but it's just nowhere near as build enabling as having universal mana reservation reduction is. So for that reason, yeah, it's good, but it's not ridiculous. Next up we have belts. Now, amulets had the most impressive mods in the Redeemer pool of anything, but we'll jump over to the belts now, which have a little bit less. So, the first thing to say is that the belt has changed over the last few weeks. a while ago, the belt was the most powerful defensive slot in the game. This was the case up to, but not including Delve League. Up till then, you could stack all sorts of good things like life, percentage life, flask effectiveness, and big resists on the belt. Now, all of that's still possible, but the introduction of Delve fossils totally changed the crafting meta for belts. And now there's a number of mods that will give you a big chunk of increased damage on your belt slot. So, some of these mods, and these are in the Delve section, if you're a build that's dealing fire damage, the Scorch Fossil has a mod that deals 20 to 30% increased fire damage. If you're dealing lightning damage, again, there's a similar version. Cold damage, there's a similar version. That comes from the Frigid Fossil there. But then there's also another stacking one, increased elemental damage, that comes from prismatic fossils. So there's a lot of things together that can add to making the belt into a premier damage slot as well. And ultimately, the balance between dealing damage and being able to endure damage is going to be a decision you'll have to make on your character. So with that in mind, I want to assess that there is a pretty high opportunity cost for belt slots. Mods have to be good to make it, in preference to some of the other things that were already available, like increased percentage life on an Elder belt. So, for belts, prefixes, we have the conditional cold damage and unconditional cold damage. So, conditional cold damage, 36 to 40% increased damage with hits against chilled enemies. 36 to 40% is a lot of extra damage. This is a really solid mod. However, it doesn't help against enemies at full life, and it doesn't help against enemies you haven't hit for a while, and it also may not help against the highest hit point monsters. If you're unable to land a single chill on them, then you might be stuck not able to benefit from this mod. In most cases, landing a critical hit on a monster is likely to inflict a chill. It's likely to inflict enough cold damage to at least imply a chill, and so then that will help you deal more damage on your deal increased damage on your subsequent hits on that monster. I still think that this is a really strong mod. Next up, we have increased cold damage, which the numbers are not quite there compared to the Delve version. The Delve version is 20 to 30%, and so I think of this more as a backup. This is a solid mod. I'll take it if it rolls, but I would rather get the Delve version there. Flask effectiveness is the last remaining prefix, and 8 to 10% increased effective flasks is something that really gets underestimated by newer players, but that once you're a veteran, once you've got your hands on powerful flasks, this is an incredibly powerful mod. There's a lot of flasks that just are unique flasks that just do ridiculous things, and this makes them even more ridiculous. With all this in mind, I'm actually pretty impressed with the mod pool on Redeemer belts. If you have a belt that has 2 prefixes and 1 empty prefix, so it's a non-Redeemer belt, it's got 2 prefixes already rolled, 3 suffixes already rolled, you're happy with the belt as it is, then slamming it with a Redeemer Exalt is actually a pretty good shot, especially if it's dealing cold damage. Your build is dealing cold damage. You've got a lot of good mods that you can roll. From a suffix perspective, there is conditional attack speed and there is conditional projectile damage. So these are during flask effects. The numbers on these are high enough to make them pretty impressive, and so I consider these to be good mods. Less impressed with percentage mana recovery rate, and remove chill and freeze when you use a flask it's serviceable, but I'm not that impressed with it. One thing that's of interest here is that pretty much most of the good mods on the Redeemer belts are cold damage. This means there is a lot of space for rolling a Redeemer belt using frigid fossils and potentially prismatic fossils as well. I think there's a lot of space for going and trying to roll up something that is a very damage-focused belt that has a lot of emphasis on dealing more cold damage and that uses just a 2-socket resonator with a prismatic and a frigid fossil. If you want life on the belt as well, then that's going to come at the expense of dealing less damage, but then you could add a pristine fossil into the mix as well and make you more likely to get a belt that fits your needs. Lots of very powerful options there, and I think that the Redeemer pool adds quite a bit to them. Next up we have rings. So, Rings have some interesting things going on for them. But rings are another one of those slots that newer players tend to use them for defense, at least once they get the basics of the game down pat, and then veterans start trying to add damage to them as well. And the Redeemer mod pool will help you with the adding damage section of that. So, prefixes are a solid source of cold damage and a very mediocre source of other damage. Let's have a look at the mods I think are good. There is this hybrid chance to freeze and flat cold damage against chilled or frozen enemies. I think this mod is quite strong. I think it's easy to underestimate. Chance to freeze is something that really does add up when you get a lot of it. And it's also needed for, well, not that cold builds tend to be elemental overload, but it gives you that as an option. But and to still inflict freezes whilst using elemental overload. And it's, yeah, just generally a solid all-around mod. I think that this is quite strong. Next up we have flat cold damage per frenzy charge. This is a very niche mod, but it's a lot of cold damage for a raider. The numbers are high if you can get 7 or more frenzy charges, and especially if you can get, say, around the 10 mark. Now, just importantly, I'm pretty confident that this mod is not compatible with the similar mod that comes from Essences of Horror. It's of the same type, so it has the same mod group name, and it has higher numbers. In fact, it's the highest tier version of this, but the Essence of Horror one is always Divine Perfect, so it's 4 to 7. It's not none of this 3 to 4 to 6 to 7. So that means that it's going to be just it's a flat out better version. But Essences of Horror are considerably more expensive to craft with than using things like Frigid Fossils that will make this roll quite frequently. So with that in mind, I think that this is a fairly solid mod for a very single niche, but it's not a great all-round mod. The last one that we've got that I think is worth mentioning here, because there is this projectile attack damage, but the numbers just feel a little bit too low on it, there is Minions deal 22 to 25% increased damage. This is really solid. Now, one thing that is quite tricky on the Redeemer's Rings, you'll notice there's a real tension. Some of the mods on it are very much for cold damage to attacks. Other ones are for totally different types of damage scaling. And this is going to be tricky for builds because you'll often roll up an item and think, oh, I could hit this with a Redeemer's Exalted Orb. If I get lucky and get one of the cold damage theme things, it's going to be great for me. But if I end up getting the minion damage, then I've wasted my Redeemer's Exalts. Redeemer's Exalts are rare, they're expensive, so it's a fairly big deal to use one and get nothing for it. This is going to be an expensive gamble because there are these different ways that the item can go. And also there's the increased evasion rating, which I feel the numbers on are just a bit too low to be recommending it as a strong mod. Now, in the Redeemer suffixes, the suffix mods I feel are mostly trash with one exception, and that exception is pretty impressive. That is the quite rare mod that curses enemies with level 5 or 8 frostbite on hit. This is really strong if you can roll it, and generally speaking, if you want this mod on an item, you probably know that you want it, and you'll have a bit of it. You may be interested in a video I put out yesterday on how to make a double curse on hit item. So I made a ring that had both frostbite and elemental weakness. You still need to exceed the normal curse limit somehow. I've got an extra curse on my body armor. You can find it wherever you want. But there's plenty of ways to do that in the game as it stands now. In fact, it's easier to stack more curses than it has ever been in the past before. Now, there are huge synergies again for rings on rolling these good mods together with Frigid Fossils. Frigid Fossils will make all of the cold rolls 10 times as likely as they otherwise be, and you want these cold mods to come as a cluster, same as you do with the belts. Likewise, Prismatic Fossils add a 5 times multiplier to cold, fire, or lightning tagged mods. So for that reason, if you can use both of them, Prismatic and Frigid, you're 50 times as likely to roll any specific Redeemer cold mod that you would otherwise be. You're also 50 times as likely to roll any normal drop pool cold mods, such as this quite disappointing series that lead up to Polar and Entombing. So, you know, it's not like it's necessarily 50 times as likely, because some of the other mods that will end up being 50 times as represented as well. The good mods will still be rare, but they're available. using Frigid Fossils does add a bit of a turd into the drop pool, unfortunately. That is Cold Damage Leeches Life, which I don't think is something that many builds want. But I still think that Frigid and Prismatic Spam may be worth your while. The other thing to note is that these mods work well with Turbulent Catalysts in the Metamorph League, which can then give you 20% increased effect of a lot of these mods. Next up we have Body Armor, and I was so underwhelmed with the Body Armor that I'm basically jumping over this slot entirely. I don't think there's really anything fantastic that stands out in Body Armor, as far as Body Armor goes, so I'm going to leave that one out entirely. Next up we have the Helmets. Oh, sorry, there is the Body Armor, but I'm going to skip it. Helmets were an interesting one. They're mostly eclipsed because Shaper mods are so good. Shaper mods on Helmets are so good, Elder mods are so good. Most builds are going to want one of these or the other, and the Redeemer options just aren't powerful enough to compete with them for most builds. But there are some narrow niche options. The first one is physical damage from hits taken as cold damage. Now, this is an interesting mod. Normally taking cold damage is worse than physical damage on the surface because cold damage can also chill you and it can also freeze you. However, the strength of it is that you're going to be running around with 75% cold resist, maybe even more than 75% at endgame anyway, and so you've got a lot of mitigation against it. So even though you may be exposing yourself to the risk of being chilled or frozen, that's easily enough mitigated, and you've got a huge amount of extra defense that you can get, because a lot of the biggest hits, the ones that can one-shot you, are often big physical damage hits. For example, Shaper's Slam deals 11,500 physical damage on average, as far as I'm aware. So reducing that by 10% and turning it into cold damage has its uses. Now, something that is of interest with this mod is that you may be thinking, gee, you know what? I can already get that elsewhere. And you'd be right. There is an incursion mod that gives you 46 to 48% cold resist and 9 to 10% of physical damage from hits taken as cold damage. The interesting thing is that you can actually get both of these on the same item. So the way that this works, you are playing any of the content in the game that can drop an incursion item, and it drops a helmet. And that helmet happens to be pretty damn good already and have a similar mod to this on it. If that helmet has a free prefix on it, you can slam a Redeemer's Orb on it and hope to get this mod, 7 to 10% of physical damage from hits taken as cold damage. Because you're using a Redeemer's Orb, the only things that can roll are things from the Redeemer pool, and there's actually a pretty good chance. It's 2 in 7 of getting tier 1 and 2 in 7 of getting tier 2. So there's a good chance of getting one of these two mods, and this can make for a very powerful defensive layer. Suddenly, you can be converting 20% of incoming damage, incoming physical damage can be converted into cold. Now, there is definitely one of these on the market. So there is someone that's trading one of these helmets that's got 20% physical to cold conversion on it. So it is definitely possible to roll. However, it has been possible to roll at some point in the league. I'm not confident that this is working as intended. I'm not confident it will always be possible to roll these two mods together on an item. It seems like they're deliberate because this is a prefix and the incursion mod in question is a suffix. So it feels like it might be intended that you can get both on one item, but I'm not absolutely confident that it is. So that's the first niche. It's a very specific niche. Power charge generation is something that is usually pretty easy, but you've got to get it somewhere on a lot of builds, and this may be the best way to do it. So this mod it's objectively a powerful mod, but it's an easily replaced one. Last, there is the very niche reduced mana reservation. This is a strong mod, as we discussed earlier when we were talking about amulets, but it is one that is very easily rolled in the helmet slot. And that's because bound fossils make it so that there is a 4 to 5% chance, so top tier roll, that is very easy to get onto a helmet. I'm not that impressed with the percentage chance to freeze and increase freeze duration, likewise the shock and ignite version, or the mana regen per second. They're not rubbish mods. There'll be some use for them. If you have a Redeemer helm that is generally good and these are on it, then that's a bonus, but I don't think that it's really worth targeting them for rolling. Next up, we're going to go to the glove slot, and in the glove slot, we have some interesting conditional damage mods. So we have adds a certain amount of cold damage if you've dealt a critical strike recently, and the numbers aren't too low on this. You'll notice that it doesn't say to attacks. This is cold damage to both attacks and to spells, and it's not a tiny amount, but it's also not a magnificent amount of extra damage. It is better than anything in the normal glove pool, and so for that reason, I think you've got to consider this as reasonably good. Frenzy charges on kill. This is strong, but again, it's strong, but it's niche. Frenzy charges are also, like the power charges on the helmet, they're also something that are very powerful charges if you need them, and there's a lot of ways to generate them. But with Frenzy charges, the default way of doing so is by running the skill Blood Rage on an attack build, and Blood Rage can be a little bit awkward at times. This can be a substitute for Blood Rage. As long as you're killing enough monsters, and trust me, you will be through normal gameplay, you'll be killing lots and lots of monsters, it should not be too hard to maintain, even with the 6% tier, it should not be too hard to maintain Frenzy charges throughout an entire map, with a possible exception of them falling off if you're forced to backtrack for a while. This is a pretty strong mod, and it's one that you will know if your build benefits from Frenzy charges and can't get them any other way, and if that's the case, you should seek out a set of gloves that already have this mod on them. Alternately, it's a pretty low chance to try and slam it on. So if you've got a Redeemer's Exalted Orb, you're only 5% to get the top tier and 5% to get the bottom tier. So 10% total to get a Frenzy Charge Generation mod if you slam an already existing 5 mod set of gloves with a Redeemer's Exalt. So it's not the best chance. I would suggest that you trade for someone else's Frenzy Charge on kill gloves if you need that build. Now there is a Minion mod here which mimics the Delve mod, so that comes from Bound Fossils normally. It's a pretty solid mod, so reasonably good. And there is global chance to blind enemies on hit. This is solid defensively and something worth considering, especially if you're playing a build that can endure a few hits, but is looking to reduce the amount of damage that you take. So if you're dying to one-shots, blind on hit isn't spectacular, but if you're dying because of sustain issues, then this will really help you because it will reduce the damage per second you're taking, but it won't reduce the big burst of damage that you sometimes take. Because blind enemies, they hit you less often, but they do get lucky streaks. Next up we have boots. Now I made a video earlier on rolling boots and using the new Conquerors Exalts on them. And my general approach for rolling boots is to start now with a normal item level 86 two-tone boot and to roll it using fossils until I've got something with 35% movement speed. I'll potentially settle for 30 if the item's otherwise great, and it's got a good combination of life and resist, or at least can have that crafted onto it. However, that may well leave an open prefix or suffix slot, and there are some pretty solid options in the Redeemer mod pool. So, in the prefix slot, firstly the suffixes are mostly meh, so we're not even going to bother discussing the suffixes, we'll only discuss the prefixes. If you've got a 3 prefix and 1 or 2 suffix item, I would suggest that you look in the different mod pools instead of the Redeemer. But if you've got a 2 prefix and 3 suffix item, then the Redeemer offers quite a lot. Unaffected by Chill Ground is a bad roll, but Endurance Charge Generation on kill is great. This is a really solid defensive layer for mapping. Having 3 endurance charges up almost all the time will save your ass when you make mistakes in maps, and because we kill monsters so fast these days, even the lowest tier of this will probably keep you at full endurance charges all the time. This mod is really, really strong, and you should consider it a great hit. Physical damage added as extra cold, the numbers on it are too low, and so it ends up being a bit of a junk mod. And then there's Elusive on critical strike, which is hugely powerful, but is also quite a rare roll. If you get this though, it is really, really nice. So that covers all of the equipable things that aren't weapons. Weapons are going to be a lot faster because there's just so little to discuss in them, because there's so little that is great in the way of weapons. So firstly, I want to say I start with bows, and bows are a big meh. Next, I want to move on to one-handed weapons. That was quick, wasn't it? But there's just nothing in the drop pool for bows that can come close to the power of the Shaper pool, or to a lesser extent, even the Elder pool. The Elder pool has some good rolls in it as well. So, one-handed weapons. Daggers and wands have some impressive options on them. And these, again, these are pretty niche, but they're okay. The first one to say is Hatred Aura Effect. These are mostly caster mods. Hatred is a powerful aura, and making it better using where the only opportunity cost for doing so is burning a suffix on your dagger is really, really strong. You're probably running Hatred on say a Vaal Ice Nova character, and we'll come back to Vaal Ice Nova in a sec. But Vaal Ice Nova characters are going to really like this mod, and there's a bunch of other things that are potentially good as well. Other things that are good. Percent damage per frenzy charge is high enough, and let me just find that, there it is. The numbers on this are high enough that it may be worth making it work. This is not so much for a Frostblades type character as for a very unusual frenzy charge generating caster character. If you're in that niche, and it would be very much a build around me niche, then this is just an inherently strong mod because it can be 80 to 100% increased damage as a suffix on a weapon. We also have chance to deal double damage with spells and conditional cast speed. I think there's a lot of potential to roll Bloodstained Fossil daggers for Ice Nova, but using a base that is both Shaper and Redeemer. Both the Shaper mods, and here we're talking about particularly gain 7 to 8% of elemental damage added as extra chaos, and also the Redeemer pool, have a lot to offer for a Vaal Ice Nova character. And so I think there's a lot of potential at the higher budget end for Vaal Ice Nova characters to smash together a Shaper and Redeemer base first, and then to use Bloodstained Fossils in conjunction with other fossils in order to craft something that is truly monstrous. Wands are the same. They have pretty much the same mod pool as daggers, and so for that reason, the Redeemer mods, are basically the same ones that are good. Chance to deal double damage with spells, conditional cast speed, Hatred Aura Effect, and damage percent per frenzy charge. Next up we have one-handed maces, which have only one niche that's tiny, and that is enemies explode for 5% of their life as fire damage. This sounds really good, especially if you've used the 3% of life as physical damage explosions, but trust me, it's nowhere near as good as that because it is much harder to scale. But it's still okay, and it deletes corpses. Deleting corpses automatically is really good because one, it annoys the necromancer that you partied with. Two, it deals with porcupines before they can set off their after death attacks, and a bunch of other monsters that have after death attacks. Those after death attacks don't necessarily happen. The rest of the one-handed weapons are a steaming pile of shit, and so we're going to jump on to the two-handed weapons. Two-handed weapons are even easier to talk about than one-handed weapons. At the moment, I basically cannot recommend using a two-handed weapon in the current meta. Two-handed weapons are just mechanically and numerically inferior to dual-wielding one-handed weapons, and this is true for both casters and for melee characters or attack-based characters. Redeemer mods don't do enough to fix this. Nothing really seems to do enough to fix it at the moment. One-handed weapons in particular got miles better out of sight with the introduction of the Savior unique sword from Cyrus. But even for a caster build, you just get better results by using one-handed weapons in general. So yeah, I'm not impressed with two-handers in the current state of the game, and the Redeemer mods don't fix that. Next up we have Quivers, and Quivers are a little disappointing as well. So let's just jump across to Quivers. It's not that Quivers don't have some good mods on them in the Redeemer pool. The problem is that the Warlord mods include that's not the one I'm looking for, include bow attacks, fire, and additional arrow, which is just miles better than what's available on the Redeemer pool. Bow attacks, firing, and additional arrow is just truly an amazing mod. Likewise, there's some of the Shaper mods have some really good stuff as well. So Shaper has bow attacks, fire, and additional arrow as well. So those are where you want to be. You don't want to bother with the Redeemer Quiver because whilst they can be good, they're not as good as a Shaper Quiver. They're not as good as a they're not as good as a Warlord Quiver, so there's no real point using them. Next up we have shields, and shields are narrow but not terrible. Now I'm specifically bringing up the mods for energy shield only shields at the moment. Sorry, I think I'm actually no. I need to fix that. I'm currently looking at strength and intelligence ones, so things like a champion's cut shield. Let's jump across to the pure intelligence shields, and there's a small number of mods that are of interest here. Prefixes, nothing is of interest, and I think generally you're going to want, if you're running a shield, you either want the energy shield on it, or you want the life mods on it if you're a life build. And so for that reason, most of your prefix slots are going to be clogged up with good stuff from other sources. Increased maximum cold resistance is welcome, but I just don't think it's good enough to worry. However, on the suffixes, there's a couple of good options. Firstly, there is a very powerful mod with low numbers, and that is 8 to 10% increased effect of auras on you. This is really strong if you play with a dedicated aura bot, and it is serviceable but unspectacular if you're playing by yourself but run Discipline as an aura on your shield. Oh, sorry, if you're running Discipline and then you have this because it gives you more energy shield. I think that this is okay without being extraordinary, and it's a mod to be happy if you get it, but not to go out of your way to chase. Curse effectiveness is similar. Most builds that want to stack curse effectiveness usually end up using Atziri's Reflection as their dream endgame shield, but this is something, Atziri's Reflection is an expensive item. This is something that you could potentially use to beef up your curses before then, and have something that's pretty solid while you're trying to get that. We also have minimum frenzy charges, which is an interesting mod, but a pretty narrow one. +2 to minimum frenzy charges is nice. It's a decent increase in attack speed and damage, but I think if you wanted to increase attack speed and damage, you would probably not be using a shield in your offhand. You'd use something else. However, I'm sure that there will be people who find a home for that specific narrow niche. Overall, I think there's some okay things in Redeemer shields, but I think that the Warlord just offers more. The Warlord shields, if you're running a shield, I think that you're getting more potentially out of having increased endurance charges and increased physical damage reduction. These are just better than what's available on the Redeemer for most builds, and so for that reason, I would say that Warlord shields are probably a superior option to Redeemer ones. Okay, so that covers every single item class. It's a pretty exhaustive run through of them all. Hopefully people have found it useful. My key takeaway from this is that the best slots to have Redeemer items are probably going to be your belt if you are a cold damage build, and your ring slots if you are dealing cold damage and care about frenzy charges in particular. If you can meet those criteria, then there's a lot available for you in the Redeemer slots. Even if you don't, there's still a few things that might be juicy, but in a lot of cases, the Shaper and Elder items are going to offer more. Lastly, the Amulet slot is incredibly powerful this league, and so that's going to be something you've got to take into consideration, that single mod, the +1 to the level of all cold skill gems, is so powerful that it might transform what you want on your Amulet, and that's something else to consider as well. But anyways, if you've got any comments or questions, definitely fire away in the chat below. Otherwise, I'm going to leave it there, and I hope you have a good one.